Somebody ask her what she really came to this church looking for.
Joy, what is she talking about?
While we're airing things out today, somebody should ask him what actually happened to Bisi.
Bisi? What happened with Bisi, Peter?
You don't get to ask me that right now. You haven't answered my question.
That's not as important as what you're not telling me.
Well, I don't know what he's talking about.
Then neither do I. But why is your face doing that? Welcome to Labari Haven, home of African stories that stay with you.
2 accusations, 2 secrets, 1 room, and the 2 people everyone came to celebrate turning on each other in a way neither of them ever anticipated. If you watched part 1, you already know these 2 have been hiding things from each other since the day they met. What you just watched is the moment that hiding finally stops being a private problem and becomes a very public one. This is part 2 of Battle of Deception. If you're new here and you haven't watched part 1 yet, you might want to do that first. If you're back for more, welcome. Hit subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel grow. Let me know where you're watching from and let's unpack everything that led to this moment. Buckle your seatbelts, it's about to be a ride. Peter asked Joy out properly 2 weeks after that Sunday of the folded tablecloths, and he did it the old-fashioned way, in person, after service, his hands doing something with his car keys that give away more nerves than his voice did. "I'd like to take you out," he said, "somewhere quiet if you're comfortable with that." Joy had rehearsed a version of this moment in her head more times than she would ever admit, had practiced the exact temperature of interest a woman like the one she was building was supposed to show, warm enough to encourage, modest enough to seem unhurried. What she had not planned for was the small, genuine flutter under her ribs when he actually asked, a flutter with no strategy behind it at all. "I'd like that," she said, and was faintly, privately alarmed at how easily the words came without needing to be arranged first. He picked her up on a Saturday evening, and her building's gate man, a stout, cheerful man named Baba Silas, who had appointed himself unofficial guardian of Joy's honor within a week of her moving in, met Peter at the gate with the kind of ceremonial suspicion that quickly melted into full-throated enthusiasm once he decided Peter passed inspection. "Ah, Oga," Baba Silas said, clapping his hands together as though Peter had just scored a goal. "So, it is you who has been putting that smile on Madam Joy's face every morning. I've been wondering, because this compound has never seen a woman smile for no reason like that before." He leaned in, lowering his volume to a volume that was somehow louder than his normal speaking voice. "Let me tell you something true, sir. A man who wakes up early to greet the sun will not spend his evening afraid of the dark. You have been coming here early and coming here often. That is a very good sign." Peter laughed, genuinely for the first time all week. "I'll take that as a compliment, sir," he said.
"It is the highest compliment I know how to give," Baba Silas said solemnly, as though confirming a legal fact. "Young man, do not waste this one. Many men spend their whole lives searching for gold in faraway rivers, when the gold they were looking for was standing quietly right here in their own compound. God does not usually repeat himself when he has already answered a prayer this clearly." Joy came out at that exact moment, laughing before she had even heard the whole joke, and the sight of her laughing, unguarded, at something as small as Baba Silas's nonsense, did something to Peter's chest that he chose not to examine too closely while driving. Dinner was at a quiet restaurant overlooking the water, and it began, as these things do, with the safe questions: favorite meals, childhood memories, carefully edited for content, the kind of gentle testing 2 people do when each is trying to determine how much of the other's story can be trusted. Joy told him a version of Abba that was true in outline and false in almost every detail that mattered: a poor but loving household, a father who worked hard, no mention of what 19 had actually cost her. Peter told her about Lagos, about the shipping company, about a general and comfortably vague, not always making the best choices in his 20s. No mention of Bisi. No mention of the second one. No mention of the specific shape of the damage he had left behind him. Both of them listened to the other's careful, curated history and thought privately, with something close to relief, that they had finally found someone who understood the value of not dwelling on the past. Neither of them noticed how much that relief should have worried them. "Can I ask you something?" Joy said, near the end of the meal, and there was a genuine hesitation in it now, not performed. "Why me? There are, I'm sure, women at church who are prettier, more established, less complicated." Peter considered the question longer than she expected, turning his glass slowly. "Because you don't perform," he said finally. "Everyone else I meet is trying to be impressive. You are just present. I noticed you before I ever spoke to you because you weren't trying to be noticed. That's rare." Joy smiled and said thank you, and meant underneath the words something closer to a wince, because she understood better than he ever could exactly how much performance had gone into looking like a woman who wasn't performing at all. "What about you?" she asked, turning the question back on him, as she had learnt long ago to be the safest thing to do whenever a conversation pointed too directly at herself. "What made you decide it was time to actually want this? Marriage, I mean. Settling." Peter was quiet for a moment, tracing the rim of his glass. "I got tired of being good at living," he said finally. "It's a strange thing to be good at. Nobody puts it on a resume, but some of us practice it for years without realizing that's what we are doing." He looked up at her, something unguarded in his face for just a second. "I wanted to be good at staying instead. I'm still learning how." It was, Joy would think much later, one of the truest things he ever told her, and at the time she had simply nodded and reached for his hand across the table, moved by a sincerity she recognized because she was busy building her own version of the exact same performance. If you've ever watched someone fall for the version of you that you built on purpose and felt that little twist of guilt mixed with relief, comment "I know that feeling" below. This is only the beginning of what these two are going to have to carry. He walked her back to the flat that night, and at the gate, Baba Silas, pretending very unconvincingly not to be watching from his little wooden stool, called out after them without any shame at all. "Sir, walk slowly. There is no need to rush a road this good." He shook his head, marveling at his own wisdom. That is how life is. Some men will search for gold at the bottom of a river and complain when the river gives them nothing, while a woman like Madame Joy is standing right here, shining like a newly minted coin, and you two are taking your time like this is a film production. Joy laughed so hard she had to hold on to the gate for balance, and Peter, walking back to his car with that laughter still ringing behind him, thought not for the first time that he could get used to a version of his life that sounded exactly like that.
3 weeks and 4 days later, Peter finally brought Joy to meet Joseph properly, over suya and cold drinks at a spot Joseph swore had the best grilled meat in the whole of Port Harcourt, an opinion he defended with the seriousness of a man discussing national security. Joseph liked her immediately, and without effort, the way he liked most people who went performing at him. And for the first hour, the conversation moved easily between church gossip, Joseph's exaggerated complaints about his logistics clients, and Peter's visible, slightly embarrassed happiness, which Joseph clocked within the first 10 minutes and refused to let go of. "Look at this one," Joseph said, gesturing at Peter with a skewer of meat. 6 months ago, this man's face was as serious as a tax inspector. Now, look at him, smiling like someone who just won a visa lottery. He turned to Joy with mock gravity. "Sister Joy, I want to inform you officially. This is the happiest I've seen this man since university. And even in university, it was a rare occasion." Joy laughed and asked, mostly out of politeness, how the two of them had met. And Joseph, delighted to have an audience for old stories, launched into an account of university mischief that eventually, the way these stories always do, wandered somewhere else entirely. "You know," he said, waving his skewer for emphasis, "this life will show you all kinds of people. I used to have a friend in Abuja. We did a little business together years back, and this guy fell for a woman who nearly finished him. Beautiful girl, sweet talker, church girl and everything, until she disappeared with almost 2 million naira and 3 different stories about who she even was. He shook his head, chuckling at the absurdity of it now. Distance had turned old pain into anecdote. The mad thing is, even the name she used with him wasn't her real name. My friend found out later she'd done the same thing to 2 other men in 2 other cities. Smooth talker, that one. Had this small way of tilting her head when she was lying, like she was thinking hard about telling you the truth. My friend still remembers that head tilt to this day. Traumatized the poor man. He laughed again, moving on to the next story before he had finished registering that Joy had gone very quiet, her hand very still around her drink, her smile arriving half a second slower than it should. Peter didn't notice. He was watching Joy the way men in love watch the women they're in love with, seeing warmth and stillness, and nothing underneath either. Joseph did notice eventually, in the small pause after his own laughter had faded, and something flickered across his face, brief and unplaceable, before he moved the conversation somewhere safer. Anyway, he said, waving a hand as though clearing smoke, that's ancient history. My friend has moved on, married a good woman now, 3 children. Every wound heals if God says so. He turned his attention back to the meat, adding almost as an afterthought, funny thing is, till today, nobody ever found out her real name. She used at least 3 different ones that we know of. Chidinma with one man, Amaka with another, something else entirely with my friend. Like she had a whole wardrobe of herself and just picked whichever one fits the room. That's frightening, Joy said, and was proud, distantly, how normal her voice sounded even as something in her chest folded tightly into itself. Very frightening, Joseph agreed cheerfully, already reaching for another skewer. Which is why I always tell Peter, know the person, not just the performance. Anybody can perform for 6 months. Real character only shows under pressure. Peter laughed and raised his drink in a mock toast to that wisdom, entirely unaware of how close the toast had come to landing directly on the woman sitting beside him. Joy excused herself to the restroom not long after and stood in front of the mirror for a full minute, gripping the edge of the sink, running through every word Joseph had said as though replaying evidence. Head tilt, different name in different cities, 2 million naira. All of it was close enough to feel like a hand closing slowly around her throat. She fixed her face in the mirror, the way she had fixed it in 100 mirrors in 100 cities, and walked back out smiling. If a story has ever made your stomach drop the way Joy's just did, that quiet, cold feeling of a door you thought was locked creaking open somewhere behind you, comment the head tilt below, and let's see how many of you are paying close enough attention to remember that detail later. The trouble with Peter's past was that it did not stay respectfully in Lagos the way he had hoped it would. It happened at a joint church and community outreach, 3 months into their courtship, a health fair GGM co-hosted with a handful of other churches in the area, the kind of event where half the congregation showed up in matching branded t-shirts, and Peter, ever eager to be seen doing the right things for the right reasons, had volunteered to help with logistics. He was directing a delivery van towards the registration tent when a woman near the crowd's edge stopped mid-sentence, stared at him for a long moment and said his name like it had cost her something to say it. Peter. Peter turned and the color left his face so fast that Joy, standing 20 feet away with a clipboard in her hand, noticed it before she even registered who the woman was. Bisi had changed in 6 years, was better dressed now, carried herself with the settled confidence of a woman who had rebuilt something out of what he'd left behind. But her eyes, when they landed on him, held exactly the same expression they'd held the last time he saw her, in a car, in silence, 6 years ago. I didn't expect to see you here, she said, and there was no anger in her voice yet, which somehow made it worse, just a flat, exhausted kind of surprise. Bisi, Peter started, and had absolutely nothing to follow it with. It's fine, she said, although her face said it was not remotely fine. I'm not here to make a scene. I actually moved here for work. Small world. A pause, her eyes flicking briefly towards Joy, who had drifted closer without meaning to. Is this your fiancé? Peter said, too quickly, the word landing strange in his own mouth for a moment. They weren't engaged yet, not technically. He didn't correct himself. Bisi looked at Joy for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her eyes. Pity maybe, or a warning she decided in the end not to give. "Congratulations," she said, and the word came out clean and cold. And then, almost as an afterthought, she added quieter, meant only for Peter, even though Joy stood close enough to catch it. "I hope you tell her everything before she signs up for the rest of it. That's all I will say." She turned and walked back into the crowd without waiting for a response, without giving Peter the chance to say the 6 years' worth of things he had apparently been carrying and never once said out loud. The silence that followed lasted the length of the drive home. Joy staring out the window, Peter gripping the wheel like it owed him an explanation. "Who was that?" Joy asked, her voice carefully, deliberately even. "An old friend," Peter said. "You went completely pale, Peter. Friends don't do that to each other's faces." He was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that comes right before a man decides how much truth he's actually willing to hand over. "It's complicated. Old relationship. It didn't end well. I'd rather not relive it if that's all right." Joy let it go, out loud. She was good at letting things go out loud, while keeping them somewhere else entirely, somewhere with a lock on the door. And this one went straight into that room alongside the head drilled and the 2 million naira and Joseph's laughing, unknowing voice. She thought about the exact phrase Bisi had used, "Tell her everything before she signs up for the rest of it," and turned it over for the rest of the evening, the way a person turns over his stone looking for what's underneath.
She thought, watching the street lights slide past the window, that it was strange, the way two people could be building a life together, made almost entirely out of things they'd both silently agreed not to ask about. If you've ever watched someone's face change color at the sight of their own past walking towards them, and felt that instant, gut-deep certainty that there's a story there nobody's going to volunteer about, drop a comment with just one word: complicated. Because that's exactly the word people use right before the truth eventually comes out anyway. Peter arrived early to pick Joy up for a Thursday evening prayer meeting. Early enough that the gateman, mid-conversation with a delivery man, simply waved him through the compound gate without ceremony for once. And Peter, in no particular hurry, walked toward her ground floor flat at an unhurried pace, already composing in his head the small joke he planned to make about her being late. Her sitting room window was open a crack, the evening breeze doing what evening breezes do, and Peter was close enough to it, close enough to raise his hand to knock on her door, when her voice reached him first and stopped him cold. It was not her church voice. It was not even the voice she used with him in private, warm and slightly teasing. This voice was flat, quick, businesslike, the voice of someone closing a transaction rather than having a conversation. "I told you already, that's not how this works. You don't get to change the arrangement after the fact just because you are impatient. No, listen to me. I said what I said and I'm not repeating myself for your comfort." Peter stood very still, his raised hand frozen an inch from the door, straining to catch more, but her voice dropped lower for the next several sentences, urgent and controlled, and he caught only fragments. "Not my problem how you explain it to them. I never promised you a timeline. If you push this, you will regret pushing it." A long pause. Then, quieter, almost weary. "I have to go. Someone's here." Peter's stomach dropped somewhere around his shoes. He stepped back from the door fast, fumbling his phone out of his pocket for cover, pretending to check a message he did not have. And by the time Joy opened the door, 30 seconds later, dressed and smiling, bag already on her shoulder, there was nothing in her face at all, except the warm, unhurried welcome she always gave him. "You're early," she said, delighted, reaching up to straighten his collar in a small wifely gesture that made something in his chest ache even through the confusion. "Take your time," he said, and his voice came out almost entirely normal, which surprised him. The drive to the church was full of her usual warmth, a story about something funny Tama had said, a question about his week, and Peter answered all of it on some kind of autopilot, half of his mind still standing outside that window, replaying a voice he had never once heard him use, cold and sharp and entirely unfamiliar. He told himself it could have been anything. A difficult work call, if she even had the kind of work that involved difficult calls. He realized with some discomfort that he'd never actually asked her precisely what she did for income, only that she managed a few small ventures, a phrase he had accepted at the time as modesty rather than looked at closely enough to question. Maybe a family matter, maybe an old landlord dispute. He did not ask her about it. He told himself this was respect for her privacy, the same grace he would want extended to himself. He did not examine too closely how convenient that explanation was and how it matched almost exactly the shape of every excuse he had ever made for keeping his own past buried. The following week, he found a small, ordinary reason to ask about her work anyway, easing into it over lunch, careful to sound like idle curiosity rather than investigation. "You've never really told me what these small ventures of yours involve," he said, smiling. "Should I be worried you're secretly running the black market?" Joy laughed, and the laugh was so easy, so immediate, that it disarmed him almost completely. Nothing that exciting. Fabric trading, a bit of importation, some consulting for smaller businesses trying to get organized. It's not glamorous, but it pays. She said it smoothly, with just enough specific, boring detail to sound entirely true, the way she had learned to say most things. Peter nodded, satisfied, and let the subject drop, because the answer was reasonable and her face gave him nothing to argue away. And a man in love, he was discovering, could talk himself out of almost any doubt if the alternative was losing something that finally felt like home. That night, lying awake, he found himself doing something he had not done in months, running back through small moments with joy, a flicker here, a pause there, searching for cracks in a foundation he had until an hour ago considered completely solid. He found more than he expected once he started looking. Not proof of anything, just a growing, uncomfortable sense that the woman he had built an entire fresh start around might have rooms in her he had never once been invited into. If you've ever overheard someone you love sound like a stranger for 30 seconds and spent the rest of the night convincing yourself you probably imagined it, comment 30 seconds below, because Peter is about to learn that some doubts don't stay quiet no matter how hard you try to talk them down. He proposed anyway. Whatever doubt had crept in that Thursday evening lost its argument over the following weeks against everything else Joy gave him. Her patience during his long work trips, the way she prayed over difficult decisions instead of rushing them, the steady, undramatic comfort of simply being near her. Peter reasoned, the way people in love reason, that everyone carried old business they didn't discuss, that he certainly did, and that demanding a woman's full history before trusting her was a hypocrisy he was not prepared to commit while sitting on his own. He went to Joseph first, the way a man does when he has finally made up his mind and needs someone to tell him he's not crazy, and found his old friend in his office late on a Tuesday evening, surrounded by shipping manifests and a half-eaten plate of rice. "I'm going to propose to Joy," Peter said without preamble, and watched Joseph's face do several things at once before settling on something that looked mostly like happiness. "Finally," Joseph said, standing to clasp his hand. "You have changed, my friend. The man I used to know in Ibadan would run in the opposite direction the moment a woman said, 'I love you,' too loud. Now look at you, buying a ring, planning to kneel in a garden. God is indeed faithful." He laughed, and Peter laughed with him, and for a moment the room was simply two old friends being glad for each other. Then Joseph's smile settled into something quieter. "You've checked her well, I hope," he said, more gently than the question strictly needed to be asked. "Not just her heart, her story. Man like you, coming from where you're coming from, you need to marry someone whose past you actually understand, not just someone whose present you enjoy." Peter felt something tighten briefly in his chest. The window, the voice, the phrase she'd used, a few small ventures, that he had never once pressed further. "I know her," he said, and heard even as he said it how much that sentence was doing the work of an answer he didn't actually have. Joseph studied him for a moment, the same old careful look from months ago, then let it go with a small shrug, choosing, as he always did with Peter, loyalty over confrontation. "Then go and marry her, my brother. Just remember, marriage does not hide anything. It only gives it more room to grow."
Peter thought about that sentence the whole drive home, and thought about it again 3 days later, kneeling in the church garden with a ring in his shaking hands, and told himself, the way he had told himself so many things over the years, that he would deal with whatever needed dealing with once the wedding was safely behind them. He proposed on a Sunday afternoon at the small garden behind the church that the older members liked to sit in after service. down on one knee in front of a modest but growing crowd of GGM members who had, over the past 4 months, adopted the couple's romance as something of a communal project. "Joy James," he said, ring box open, hands only slightly shaking. "I came to this city looking for a fresh start, and I found something I didn't even know I was still allowed to hope for. Will you marry me?" Joy's hands flew to her mouth, and the tears that followed were disturbingly, entirely real, no performance required, because underneath every calculation she had ever made about this exact moment sat a woman who had genuinely, dangerously started to want the answer to matter. "Yes," she said. "Yes, of course, yes." The garden erupted. Somewhere in the small crowd, Sister Ngozi immediately burst into a worship chorus that half the congregation joined without missing a beat, and Elder Fubara, wiping his eyes with theatrical enthusiasm, clasped both their hands and declared at a volume clearly meant for the whole garden to hear, "This love, this one here, this is not the kind of love an apprentice writes. This is the kind of love God himself sat down and wrote, personally. No shortcuts, no assistant, no angel standing in for him. Original work straight from the author's own hand." Tama, crying and laughing at once, hugged Joy so hard she nearly knocked her off balance. "I knew it," she kept saying. "I knew it from the day you two stayed back to fold those tablecloths. I told everybody. I said, watch, something is happening there." Even Baba Silas, informed of the news later that evening by an ecstatic Joy, threw both hands into the air right there at the gate and declared the engagement a personal triumph of his own matchmaking instincts, insisting with total conviction that he had known it since day one, because a wise gate man can smell a good marriage coming the same way he smells rain before the first cloud arrives. For one long, glowing week, Joy allowed herself simply to exist inside the happiness without picking it apart for danger. And Peter, watching her laugh freely at church functions, genuinely, unguardedly, in a way he was coming to recognize as entirely her own, decided that whatever he'd overheard through that window 3 weeks ago was simply none of his business, and that some questions were better left where they were, buried, quiet, and safely out of reach. Neither of them noticed in the glow of it all that Joseph had gone unusually quiet at the announcement, congratulating them warmly enough, but with something careful behind his eyes that he did not share with anyone, not yet. If you're still with us and enjoying the ride, let me know where you're watching from tonight. Drop your city or country in the comments. I love seeing how far this story travels. And if this proposal scene got you even a little emotional, hit that like button. It really does help push this story to more people who need to see it. The formal introduction happened 5 weeks later. Peter's mother and 2 aunties traveling in from Lagos in a hired bus loaded with more foodstuff than the occasion strictly required, and Joy's side represented by an uncle standing in for her late father, a role he clearly relished far beyond what the actual duties demanded. The 2 families met in the church's event hall, round tables draped in white and gold, and what began as a stiff, formal exchange of pleasantries dissolved within the hour into the particular chaos of 2 Nigerian families discovering they had several mutual acquaintances, a shared village 3 towns apart, and, in Peter's mother's case, absolutely no intention of being outdone by anyone in the room. "My son has suffered for many years, Many years I have been praying, fasting, even fasting during Christmas. Do you know what that means for a Yoruba woman to fast during Christmas? That is how serious my prayers were. And God, in his infinite mercy, has finally sent this Rivers girl to rescue my only son from confusion." She turned to Joy and gripped both her hands with the force of a woman sealing a contract. "My daughter, thank you for saving my son's destiny. I was starting to consult pastors, prophets, even one woman in the market who claims she can see visions. Don't ask me how that went." Joy's uncle, not to be outmatched, rose to his feet with the gravity of a man about to deliver a national address. As the head of this family in the absence of my late brother, I want to officially state for the record that this young man has satisfied all our requirements. He greeted properly, he did not come empty-handed, and most importantly, he paused for effect, surveying the room. He did not once check his wristwatch while I was speaking, which in this generation is nothing short of a miracle. The hall erupted in laughter, Joseph loudest among them, and even Bisi's name, which had sat heavy and unspoken in the corner of Peter's mind for weeks, seemed for one afternoon to lose some of its weight under the sheer volume of celebration around him. Tama, seated beside Joy for moral support, leant in during a lull in the speeches. "Your mother-in-law is going to be exhausting," she whispered, grinning, in the most loving way. And Joy whispered, "I know," and laughed. And for an unguarded moment, watching Peter across the room being embraced by an auntie he clearly never met before today, she let herself simply enjoy being wanted by people who had no idea what wanting her would eventually cost them.
The full truth about Bisi reached Joy almost by accident, 3 weeks after the engagement, through Sister Nongozi, who possessed alongside a genuinely warm heart an encyclopedic knowledge of everyone's business within a 50-kilometer radius of the church. They were arranging flowers for the following Sunday's service, a task that, somehow, over an hour, had turned into an extended and increasingly detailed conversation about the engagement. And Sister Nomozi, without any particular malice, simply mentioned, between arranging lilies, that she'd heard from a cousin who used to attend Peter's old church in Lagos, that there'd been quite a story involving Peter and a young lady some years back. "What kind of story?" Joy asked, keeping her hand steady around the flower stems, her voice carrying the just right, unhurried curiosity of someone who wasn't especially invested in the answer. "Ah, you know how these things be," Sister Nongozi said, lowering her voice to the specific register reserved for information she both shouldn't share and desperately wanted to. "The girl, Bisi, she was serious with him, wanted marriage and everything, and then she became pregnant, and instead of doing the right thing, this man now paid for her to, remove it, and just like that, packed and moved on with his life like nothing happened. My cousin said the girl cried for almost 1 year. 1 year, imagine." Joy's hands did not shake. She had trained them for 10 years not to shake at exactly moments like this. "That's terrible," she said, and meant it, though the meaning sat strangely alongside the cold, clear-eyed calculation running underneath it. The understanding that the man she was set to marry, the disciplined, church-going, reformed man everyone celebrated in that garden 3 weeks ago, had a past every bit as buried and every bit as damning as her own. She thought of the window she had stood behind, closing that call, telling herself he heard nothing. She thought of the pale, guilty look on his face at the health fair, a look she had chosen deliberately not to press. 2 people, she realized, standing in a flower-scented church hall with lily petals scattered across the table in front of her. 2 people who had each spent months carefully not asking the other the one question that mattered most, because asking it honestly would have required answering it honestly in return. She said nothing to Sister Nongozi beyond the appropriate murmurs of sympathy for a woman she had never met. She said nothing to Peter that evening, or the evening after that, or any evening in the weeks that followed, holding the truth the way she held everything dangerous, quietly, carefully, filed away in the same locked room with the head tilt, the 2 million naira, and a phone call through an open window that she still to this day was not entirely certain he hadn't heard. What she did not yet know, could not yet know, was that Peter was doing the exact same thing on his side of the engagement, carrying his own quiet certainty that something in her past did not add up, saying nothing, asking nothing, choosing the comfort of an unexamined future over the risk of an honest one. 2 people, walking toward a wedding, each convinced they alone were the one keeping a secret worth protecting. That night, alone in her flat, Joy knelt beside her bed the way she had every night for 5 months, hands folded, the posture of a woman rebuilding her life through God, exactly as she had rehearsed it in 100 church halls before this. But the words would not come the way they usually did. She stayed there a long time, saying nothing at all, simply kneeling, feeling for the first time in longer than she could remember something close to actual fear. Not the practiced useful fear of being caught, but something quieter and worse. The fear of loving a man who had already proven once that he was capable of walking away from a woman carrying his child without once looking back. If he could do that to Bisi, what would he do to me if he ever found out what I've done? She did not have an answer. She wasn't sure, kneeling there in the dark, that she wanted one yet. Across the city, in an apartment that once felt too large for one person, and now felt most nights exactly right, Peter sat with his own version of the same silence, turning Joseph's warning over in his mind. Marriage doesn't hide anything, it only gives it more room to grow. And telling himself the way he always eventually told himself, that whatever she was hiding could not possibly be worse than what he already carried. Neither of them knew how wrong that assumption would turn out to be. By the time the pre-wedding meeting started, families exchanging visits, Asoebi fabric being chosen, a date circled on a calendar in Sister Nongozi's careful handwriting, Peter and Joy had become, in the eyes of everyone who loved them, the undisputed golden couple of Good News Global Missions. Nobody in that congregation had any idea that both halves of their perfect couple were quietly holding evidence against the other and saying absolutely nothing. If you've ever found yourself protecting a relationship by staying silent about something you probably should have asked out loud, comment "I've done that" below. This is a no judgment zone. I think most of us have some point. Like this video if it kept you on edge, subscribe if you haven't already, share it with someone who loves a good slow burn, and type truth in the comments if you're ready for what happens when all of this finally comes out. I'm excited to see you in part 3.